Stop acting so small because you are the universe in ecstatic motion.
Great, good morning. Thank you so much for coming to this talk, even if it's in English. I have a habit of watching YouTube at double speed, so I talk very fast. So I apologize in advance. Okay, so today we're here to talk about the future. The future? Oh, oops. Okay, we're here to talk about the future. So before we start, I just have two quick questions for you, just to help me gauge what you guys think about the future. So if you can just, on a scale of like very up and very down, how optimistic do you feel about the next 10 years? Okay, yeah, that's, honestly pretty good. You'll be surprised at some of the answers I've gotten. Maybe then the next question. So how much power do you think you have in shaping the next 10 years? Okay, yeah, okay, a little less, but still pretty good. Okay, great. So then thank you so much for participating in my quick little survey. My name is Alicia. As Simon has introduced me, I am a senior service designer at the LEGO Group. I am an external lecturer at the Cologne International School of Design, and I'm also a mentor of the Amazing Design People list. But perhaps out of all of these titles, the one that I care most about is that I am a futurist. So a futurist is someone that thinks and designs and plays in the future. And you might be thinking, what does a designer have to do with futures? But if we look at the idea of design more than just making pretty things, Herbert Simon, who was a Nobel Prize winner for machine learning, he describes design as everyone designs who devises course of action aimed at changing the existing state into a preferred one. So you can design a chair that changes your state from standing up to sitting down. You can design a piece of visual item that makes something ugly into pretty. You can design a software that bridges a need that there wasn't bridged before. So if we look at this definition of what design is, you'll find that changing the existing state into a preferred one. It means that design is to some level inherently about the future. Because anything that we do not for this moment right now is for the future. So when we talk about futures, it's not so much that we should think about the future, but I will argue that you have the responsibility to think about the future. Because like many things in life, anything that we put out there, the impact we have is out there forever. If you design this chair, you can't undo this chair back into a living tree, just like you can't change the way that social media has affected the way we view ourselves and interact with others. So this is why that H.G. Wells, who was a sci-fi writer, he's often thought of as the father of science fiction, he said that everything is fraught with consequence, yet it is only after something has hit us hard that we set about dealing with it. And he said this almost 100 years ago, but they still ring true today. And perhaps the best example of what this looks like is the plastic bag. So it's maybe a little bit ironic to see a plastic bag with the word, the future of the sack is here for you today, written on it. But if you look at the story of the plastic bag, it was invented by a Swedish engineer. So at the time, he saw that instead of the plastic bag, people were using a lot of paper bags to carry their groceries, and they were cutting down a lot of trees. So he thought, wouldn't it be great if I can design something that's light and foldable, reusable, so we don't have to cut down trees? And despite his best intentions, we now know that the plastic bag and plastic in general has caused many more problems down the line. And this is not a unique case to just the plastic bag. In fact, Peter Singer, who is a system philosopher, he said that many of today's problems come from yesterday's solution. So then how do we avoid this? So how do we avoid the things we make today becoming a problem further down the line? And to do this, I would say that you have to think about the future. So now that we've established that you design something, if you change the current state into the preferred one, and that design is inherently about the future, I hereby knight you. You are now all futurists. So as a futurist, you will get many questions. The one that I get most often is, oh, so you can predict the future? Tell me what's going to happen the next 5 years. So unfortunately, I didn't get my own customized crystal ball when I became a futurist, and neither will you. But I get why people ask. Because the future seems so volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And these are all uncomfortable words and feelings that we have to sit with. So as humans, we naturally want to change all of these things, change volatility into stability, certainty and uncertainty into certainty, complexity into simplicity, ambiguousness into clarity. But in doing so, we kind of fall into this sort of mind trap of thinking that there's a now and that there's a certainty in the future and that there's only one way towards it. But in reality, when you think about the future, it's more like you're shining a flashlight into the darkness. What is closest and most immediate to you is the clearest, and what lies further ahead is an array of possibilities and many different paths to get there. So the point of thinking about the future has never been about accuracy because you can't predict the future, or rather, you can never predict the future correctly. Instead, we use future as a playground to think about what's not possible today, but could be possible tomorrow. So we can start having these conversations now about how we should prepare ourselves when the inevitable future comes. And everyone has different perspectives on what they think the future will look like. In my research, I would suggest that we look at the future through the lens of storytelling, speculative design, and system thinking. Because each of these schools of thought has a unique perspective on the future, and they reveal to us a truth of what the future will be. So I hope by the end of this session, you'll at least walk away with 3 new truths you've learned about the future, and 3 new ways that you can use to look at it. So let's first start with storytelling. When we talk about the future, we have to ask, where does the future exist? And this is a bit of a trick question because you find that the future doesn't exist, or rather the future doesn't exist yet. But just as cavemen, they use stories to make sense of the unknowns of the creation of the universe, we too can use stories to make sense of the unknowns of the future. When you're having late night talks with your friends over a glass of wine about where you see each other in the next 10 years, you're telling each other stories about the future. And you'll find that this is not a unique phenomena. In fact, we've been telling stories about futures for a long time and in various forms. We thought the future will have hoverboards, will have Mars potatoes, will have a knife that can slice and toast at the same time. So why are stories such a common way for us to explore the future? Perhaps because it's cheap, you don't need any you just have a mouth and you can talk. There's no restraints, you're not bound by any technical feasibilities. Or that's a really good way of drawing people in. We naturally empathize with all of the characters. But there's also a deeper reason. Richard Slaughter, who was a prolific writer in the field of future studies, described the future as an essentially interior phenomena. Because if you think about it, every experience you have with the future first starts internally in your imagination. Then you find ways of communicating these thoughts out loud, and the most common form is through stories. We use stories because when we think about the future, we're not imagining the future through logical units of measurements like time, days, KPI growth, GDP. But instead, we imagine the future as a set of experience that's different to our lives today. So if we do a simple thought experiment, the year is 2053, with 50 years down the line, or 40 years down the line, sorry. But every aspect of your life remained exactly the same. You still live in the same place, drive the same car, use the same phone, go to the same job. Would you still consider that as the future? Probably not, because we thought the future will have the hoverboards, the Mars potatoes, the knife that slices and toasts at the same time. So it is all of these things that are different to our experiences today that makes up our perception of the future. So in a way, thinking about the future is kind of like the parable of the blind man and the elephant. The one that touches the tail thinks the elephant looks like a rope. The one that touches the trunk thinks the elephant looks like a bamboo. None of us know what the future looks like, but we all can feel a little bit of what the future is like to us in our imaginations. So we find ways of communicating these thoughts out loud in the form of stories. And sometimes we get it right. Dr. Frankenstein used electricity to bring people back from the dead, much like a defibrillator would. In Star Trek, they had a replicator that's basically a 3D printer. And the Jedi has long been interacting with augmented reality in a galaxy far, far away. So just as stories contain multiple perspectives, we too try to piece the entire image of the future together through the exchange of these perspectives in the form of stories. And as we do so, the future becomes more like a collective imagination. It means that the future is more like a social dream, something we've woven together piece by piece, story by story. And in doing so, it also means that we value a future where we say that each individual's imagined experience is just as valuable as numbers, facts, and data. And so here I leave you with the first truth about the future, and that is the future is not bloodless. It doesn't mean there will be blood or war, but rather that the future has a warmth and sentiment that's uniquely human, because it first started within us. It is colored with our imaginations, hopes, and dreams, and just as we cannot be without the world, the future cannot exist without our imaginations of it. So what does it look like practically when you try to look at the future through the lens of storytelling? It means that we're assuming the explorative angle, where we say that the future is not an automatic continuation of the past, but rather we focus on all the possibilities that could happen instead. So Jens Müller, who is a professor at the Aalborg University, he said that the biggest challenge when we talk about the future hides in the fact that we can find it difficult to see the future as anything but an extension of the present through the linear projection of what we know. So how do we break out of this mindset of thinking here's the future, here's the present, and there's only one way towards it? And to do this, I would suggest you do like a 2x2. I believe many things in life can be solved by 2x2s. This is adapted by Jim Dator's 4 images of the future. So essentially, you can think of the future going in 2 directions. The future progresses in the way that we desire and the way that we don't desire. At the same time, these changes can happen incrementally, very slowly, or radically, very fast. And from here, we can really quickly divide the future into 4 different images already. On the top left, we have the continuous growth. This is maybe the one that you're most familiar with, and also the one that business people talk about, only talk about. So that's the one where everything progressing in the way that we desire, slowly into this perfect world. But at the same time, I think it's just as valuable to talk about the other futures too. You also have the eventual collapse future, which is when things don't go according to plan, maybe due to resource exhaustions, wars, new technologies, restraints, and slowly it pushes us towards an undesired future. On the top right, you have the transformed future. So that's something that a technology perhaps comes along that makes what we thought was impossible today suddenly possible. And then there's no way out for us to go back to how we used to do things. And on the bottom right, we have the dystopic survival future. That is the part where the future take a turn for the worst, but we learn how to live in this future, perhaps through the use of technologies or new social norms, and we learn how to adapt and adjust to this world. So this tool is made for conversation, that you can talk with your stakeholders or your clients or your colleague. What does each of these futures look like? How do we prevent ourselves from going to the collapse future? What do we do in the transformation case? How do we guide ourselves more towards a continuous growth? An example of this is a project by Stuart Candy. So he worked with the Hawaiian government, who is interested to know what the citizens of Hawaii thinks of Hawaii in the future. So to do this, they created 4 different stories about the future, and they actually hired actors to come in and set up the stage so that they can experience it. And in each of these futures, they got the actual citizens of Hawaii to come in and to participate and to get their response on how they think about these different futures. On the top left here, this is a candidate. They're selecting a new senator to represent Hawaii, but the candidates are all companies. So on the left, it was a virtual reality gaming company, and on the right, it was a water energy company. And the candidates were debating with each other of why they think they should represent Hawaii, but the citizens were also arguing with them, like, why do you think you get to represent me? You're just a company. So in all of these conversations, that's how you gauge what do people think about the futures and what are the ways that they hope it will be different to the experiences today. Okay, so next, let's look at speculative design. Another thing I get asked very often as a futurist is like, why? What's the point of designing for these things that will never come true? And I would say that, yeah, you're right, to a certain extent, it will never be, mass-produced. But the point of thinking about the future from the speculative design perspective is to open up space for conversations and debate. In an attempt to articulate what speculative design is and isn't, Dunn and Raby came up with this AB manifesto, where column A is everything that it isn't, and column B is everything that it is. So from this list, we see a lot of buzzword ideas that we're more familiar with in the column A, things that is not. They're saying that thinking about the future is not about problem solving or providing answers, providing solutions, innovation, consumer user-friendliness is none of those. Instead, thinking about the future is about problem finding, asking questions, design as a medium, provoke citizens and ethics. And indeed, if you think about it, why should we have taken a human-centered approach to begin with anyways? Humans is often just one actor in the complex, wicked problems that we face today. So why do we imagine futures from our perspectives alone? The future is fear. It will be there for everything. A tree, the whale, a plastic bag. And so if we have to imagine future, we have to imagine one where we as a species is decentered. This idea of not centering everything around the human might feel a little bit to some of you guys because we're so deeply rooted in this idea of anthropocentrism. It is a dualist thought that's remnants of a more religious time. It's the idea that we consider human being as the most significant entity in the entire universe, and therefore we interpret and regard the world in terms of human values and experiences only. But why should it be so? Because we as humans are limited by our own temporality of roughly 80 years, which is nothing compared to the life of a pebble, of a whale, of a plastic bag. So if we have to imagine futures, we can't just do it from our perspective alone, and we have to think of future where it's fear for all the things that it will be a part of. Perhaps this is why that last year, the US appointed their first diplomat for plants and animals. And in New Zealand, where I am from, we have granted the Whanganui River as their own legal personhood. And if we think about the point of thinking about the future being to open up space for conversations and debates, then perhaps the first debate we should have is to challenge the notion that the future is only ours. And so here we have the second truth about the future, and that the future is selfless. The future is not only about humans or you or me, and we cannot center the future around our perspective alone. We have to register ourselves outside the constraints of our own human narrative and think of ways to bring equality to everyone that deserves it. I mean, when we talk about equality now, we often mean inclusion, fighting back against discrimination or diversity, and these are no doubtingly important. But we look at equality from a non-anthropocentric perspective. It means that everything, living or non-living, they deserve a future equally. So what does it mean when we look at the future through the lens of speculative design? It means that we're looking at it from a normative angle. We're dissatisfied with the current state of affairs, and we use the future as a possibility to fix these things. But of course, this is easier said than done. Dun and Raby, they said that it is now easier for us to imagine the end of the world than an alternative to capitalism. Yet alternatives are exactly what we need. We need to dream new dreams. So how do you dream of things that has never existed? This is like asking you to come up with a new color. How do you do that? And to do so, we need to engage in counterfactual thinking. And the easiest way of doing that is just by simply asking, what if? So counterfactual thinking, it is, as it says, you're thinking counter to the facts that you already know. Because if you're unable to think of something, if you're unable to think of a different past or a different present, you're unable to think of a different future. So when you're asking what if, you are instantly entering a space where everything we know about the past and the present is uncertain. And that is a great place to birth new ideas about the future. And an example of this is still from Stuart Candy. So Wales has a commissioner for future generations. So along with the futurist, this commissioner for future generation asked, what if we can bring more equality in the decisions that we make? So there was a plot of land that was going to go under a development, and instead of telling the citizens here are the facts and numbers of what we project, they also created this design fiction item where it is a letter to the residents from the animals living in this plot of land. So they are telling the residents what does it mean to live here? What does it mean if this development goes according to plan? What does that change about their lives? So they formed this fictional idea of a parliament of all beings from this what if question in order to imagine a future where we are not at the center of it. Okay, so let's look at system thinking. It's no longer news that we live in this giant web of entanglements where everything's connected to everything. The central bank adjusting its interest rates will eventually affect the cost of your latte. So now, if everything sits on this giant web of entanglement, where does the future sit? One way you can use to think about the future is that future is change rippling through a system. The time and delay it takes for the change to reach us is the future that we anticipate. So in order to really grasp the scale of these entanglements and understanding all the actors influencing our futures, we have to think bigger and beyond ourselves. And to do this, we often rely on system thinking. So system thinking is characterized by two major philosophies of holism and synthesis. So looking at things as a whole rather than parts, and understanding things in relation to each other using synthesis. But these are not entirely new concepts. In fact, you'll find these being repeated a lot in ancient philosophies and indigenous cultures around the world. As a futurist, we often say that in order to look forward, you have to look back. So let's look back at what we can learn from the past. So if everything is connected, what is the future connected to? The most obvious one is time. But the way that we experience time now on our watch, on our phones, and weekdays and months, this is called clock time. It is actually now more of a capitalist tool for us to maximize efficiency and productivity. So if you wanted to know what was the experience of time like before capitalism took place, you can ask indigenous people. And they see time as much more multidimensional. And they would tell you that time is as a pond you can swim through, up, down, around. And to the indigenous people, they see time as much more connected to the things and systems around them. Time is connected to the tide, to the seasons, to the ripening of fruits. So as a result, the future is also not a standalone concept because time is reflected in all the things that they can see around them. And so future is also reflected in these things. This is how the Vanuatu people are able to tell upcoming cyclones based on the mango tree's early flowerings. Or the Khasi people of India, they spent decades fostering these bridges out of living tree roots, not for themselves, but for the future generations to come. Or you might remember a few years ago in Australia, there was an awful forest fire that destroyed a lot of the forests, but some of it remained untouched because the local Aboriginal people practiced ritualistic controlled cool burnings, exactly to prevent future fire, but also to kickstart the germination process. So here we see that the indigenous people have been practicing long-term, short-term futuring, system thinking, circularity, long before we even came up with a name for these concepts. And just a few years ago, BBC released an article that said short-termism is the civilization's greatest threat. But I am an optimist, and I tend to think that short-termism is a relatively new concept, because we can see from the indigenous people's ways of living, of experiencing time as things concrete to the things around them, that they're able to keep the earth in harmony for thousands of years. And perhaps there's a lot more we can learn from the way that they view time and also view future. And so here is the last truth about the future, is that the future is rooted. We often think of the future as an abstract concept somewhere in the distance, but that's not true at all. The future is extending its roots back to us, to now. The future is rooted in our experience of time, is rooted in our actions we take today, is rooted in the living systems around us, and most importantly, the future is rooted in this earth. So what does it mean when we look at future through this angle? It means that we're using a predictive angle to use historical data inputs to make informed estimates that are predictive in determining the direction of the future. You'll remember that I said earlier that you cannot predict the future, and that statement still stands. But when you look at the world through the system thinking perspective, you'll realize that things behave in patterns. So while we cannot predict the future, we can imagine which patterns are likely to repeat itself, and how might these patterns result in new things. To do this, so this is Randers, he's a Norwegian author. He wrote a book on his prediction of the world in the next 40 years. And even as a professional, he said that his forecast is just an educated guess at what he believed will happen, certainly not a description of what ought to happen. So what can we do then? What can we do to put more backing behind these predictions that we make, so it's more than just an intuition or a hunch that we may have? Often when we think about the future, we're often saying that we're looking forward. So if, for example, I wanted to know the future of facial recognition, I have to keep scanning the horizon about what are the new emerging technologies, what are the new breakthroughs, new applications, and this can be a tedious amount of work. But instead, and perhaps a more easier way of thinking about the future is simply to look back. What is the situation similar to that happening in the past? Perhaps I can look at the fingerprint technology. When that came about, which areas of our lives did it influence? What kind of new product did it result in? And then trying to notice these patterns and think, okay, now if I fold the past onto itself into the future, which of these patterns were likely to repeat, and what are the new results we might see? So for example, this is part of a work from my students at the university, and they wanted to imagine the future of education. And I said, you wish. So instead of asking them to look forward, I asked them to look back at the history of education. So on the bottom, they have the drivers. Those are the things that they identify that are pushing change to happen. And on the top, those are signals. So signals indicate that a shift is about to occur, and that there's no way for us to go back to how things are. So for example, they identified the printing press as a major driver in education because they saw soon afterwards books were more available and it was the end of illiterate society. And then not long after, there was the first public library. So this is a more detailed map they've done on the Age of Enlightenment. So what are all the different areas this has affected and what were the outcomes that it produced? So this, now I can ask them, well, you know, some people will say that we live in the age of digital enlightenment. So which of these patterns do you think is like to repeat itself? And what are some new things we might see here? So this way, we're not always just venturing into the unknown and then just thinking of the future through our best guesses, but we can also put some facts and reasons of why we think these things are likely to happen. Okay, so now if we do a quick summary, we learn from storytelling that the future is not bloodless. It is not lacking emotional warmth, but it starts with something that's uniquely human and started with our imagination. From speculative design, we learned that the future is selfless. The future is not only about us, but rather the future is fear, and that's so should we when we think about it. Finally, from system thinking, we learned that the future has roots. It is not a standalone concept floating in a distance, but the future is reflected in the actions and systems around us. But now we talked about all of the ways that the future could change, but I want to leave you with an antidote. So this is the Bezos man, and it's hard for me to find any nice, warm feelings for the world's biggest capitalist. But I was reading an interview that he had one day, and the interviewer asked him, Mr. Bezos, what do you think will be different in the next 10 years? And Jeff Bezos looked down, and he thought about it, and he said, I very frequently get the question, what's going to change in the next 10 years? And that's a very interesting question. It's a very common one. I almost never get asked the question, what's not going to change in the next 10 years? And indeed, if you're building a business, it makes more sense to build it on things that won't change, rather things that will. And you'll find that the things that won't change throughout time is needs. We as humans will always have the same needs to be loved, to be fed, to dance when there's music, and to be respected. What changes is all the technologies that surround us and the ways that we use to serve these needs. So Henry Ford is most famous for saying that if I asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. But I will argue that he asked the wrong question, because if he simply asked people, what do you need? They would have said, I need to travel faster, and that need would still stand today. So another question I get asked very often is like, what is the business value of thinking about the future? If you give me a number, why should we invest in this? And I would say that thinking about the future is like exercising a muscle. You're trying to understand that what is the balance between what is and what could be? How will the things that not change react in a world where everything could? So when the time comes when you have to make a decision about the future, you can discern between what are the things that won't change and what will. You have the mental flexibility to imagine all the different cases. You have the hard empathy to understand what future feels like for every single person. And then you have the practical skepticism to ask that, is this really the future that we desire? Okay, so if one final takeaway, I'm running out of time, that is one thing that you can take away from this session. So if you heard me speak about this in the past, I often said what I thought was most important in designing for the future was empathy, because I thought empathy was kind of the most powerful tool I have as a designer, that I can learn how to extend empathy beyond myself to listen to other people's stories of the future. I can extend empathy beyond my own species to think about what does the future look like for those that do not have a voice, or that I can extend the empathy beyond my own temporality to understand that I'm designing for systems that have existed long before me and will continue to exist without me. But because so many things has been happening the last couple of years, that I was saying that not very positive things, so my view on the future is also changing. So now I would say that the most important thing you need when you design for the future is urgent optimism. Not even like regular optimism, but like urgent optimism. Because optimism is the belief that your desired outcome will come true. So if we talk about preferred futures, if we want to get there, first we need to have the optimism to imagine what that looks like. And to do this, you need a lot of courage, right? In order to believe despite everything that you're facing, your desired outcome will come true. So how do you become more optimistic? I mean, surely it's not like American Psycho where you like look at yourself in the mirror every morning, hyping yourself up like, yeah, I'm going to be positive today. Because I'm not a naturally optimistic person either. And this was really something that I wanted to find out too. So at the start of this session, I asked you two questions. How optimistic do you feel about the next 10 years? And how powerful do you feel in shaping the next 10 years? these were the same questions I asked my students in my course. So last year, they said 44 and 47% respectively, which is, honestly not very high considering they're the literal future of the world. But I asked them the same question again at the end of the course in February. So now we see still not very high, but it's almost a 50% improvement. So what happened this 5 months that made them go from 44 to 66? And what we did there was exactly what we're doing now. We talked about the future, we did thought experiments, we designed for it, we played in it, we thought about all of these things surrounding the future. And these sort of thoughts becomes words, and words become actions, and the actions are impacting the way that we view the future in itself. So if you're not an optimistic person, I have some good news for you, and that is you can train optimism. And optimism comes from thinking, playing, and learning about the future. Because the more we know about it, the less we fear it, and the less we fear, the less overwhelming it becomes. I used to be a person that I avoided reading the news and politics because I thought, the future was something that happened to me, or the future was something decided by people in power, or the future was just inevitable. So why should I bother spending my efforts thinking about things I cannot control, or designing things that will never come to fruition? But the irony is that by doing exactly those things, I've democratized the future. I've brought back some of the power that others held of the future to myself. And in doing so, I built empathy for my own futures and our collective futures at large. And I learned that, the same thought that once terrified me about the future doesn't anymore, because I can say, sure, the future is uncertain, volatile, complex, and ambiguous. And that is exactly why the future is what I designed it to be. So thank you so much for your time, and I hope to see you in the future.